Actually, if you look at the Constitution of the United States says nothing about separation of church and state.
Absolutely not.
The First Amendment, which they always cite, the Establishment Clause, actually says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. When you think it through, the real implication of that phrase also, though, is not to prohibit religious establishment. Some people argue that. No. What it says is Congress shall make no law respecting, not prohibiting, but respecting an establishment of religion. What does that mean? Well, respecting means concerning, on the subject of, with regard to, dealing with. So it means Congress shall make no law that has anything whatsoever to do with religious establishment. Well, my friends, if it can't address the issue at all, that means it can't say yes to religious establishment, and it also can't say no. It can't interfere with anything that's done on this subject. So you'll ask me, okay, Alan, who can address it? Well, the Constitution's also clear about this. In the 10th Amendment, it says that any power that's not given to the United States government by the Constitution or explicitly prohibited by the U.S. Constitution to the states is reserved to the states respectively and to the people. That means that the power that was explicitly withheld from the federal government, the power to deal with the issue of religious establishment, and remember, that means all these issues that have to do with the relation between church and state, how you acknowledge God, whether you acknowledge God, what can be done, prayer in schools, display of monuments, all the whole range of issues that have to do with that subject, right? The federal government has no lawful authority to address those issues at all whatsoever. The 14th Amendment requires of state officials, which is that they do not act to infringe the rights, privileges, and immunities of citizens of the United States. Well, one of those privileges and immunities was the right to be free of dictation by the federal government when it comes to matters of religious conscience at the state level. That's the business of the state governments and the people of the states. It is not at all the business of the federal government. And when the federal judges get involved in it, do you know what they're doing? They are acting unconstitutionally and unlawfully. They are violating the supreme law of the land, and it is they who are doing something wrong, not Chief Justice Moore. He was actually doing what the law of this land requires him to do, defend and stand on the right of his state and his people to deal with the issue of church and state and how you acknowledge God, to deal with that issue free of federal domination. That means that we don't just have to sit there and let these judges take power they don't have under the Constitution. If they've stepped over the boundaries of their actual power as defined in the Constitution, our representatives in Congress can push them back where they belong. With a simple majority vote in the Congress, they can remove from the jurisdiction of the federal courts all those matters that have to do with these issues of church and state, and which by the power of the First Amendment, the federal government has been forbidden to address. And what we need to do is we need to rise up and demand that our representatives take this step. Demand that they defend the right of the states and the people of the states to make these decisions free from federal interference by imposing this restriction on the federal courts. And by the way, if you impose that restriction, you're not taking anything from them. Because to say that you're taking away their jurisdiction, no, that's not what's being done. They never had that jurisdiction in the first place. What you're doing is you're putting them back where they belong. It's like you have found a stolen good in a thief's house and you're returning it to the proper owner. The stolen good in this case is the right to acknowledge God and to make a decision according to our conscience through our state institutions and at the state and local level of how and in what way we will acknowledge the authority of God. That's our religious right. That is our real religious freedom. That is our real freedom of conscience in this country, and they have stolen it from us, and we must demand that the Congress use its proper constitutional authority to get it back.
If you appreciate this, I do, with all my heart.
Let's get away from a system that has bureaucracies deciding what only individual consumers are in a position to judge. Let's empower those consumers to be the ones who will be making that kind of judgment. And I think we might help to get costs down, we might help to keep quality up, and finally we'd help to do something that we all know we need. Because at some point in your life, you cease to be concerned with just health care and you become concerned with health. You want to stay healthy for the sake of your family. You want to stay healthy for the sake of your grandchildren. You want to stay healthy for the sake of the future. You don't just want people who are going to treat you when you're sick. You want people who will help you to stay well. And in addition to not achieving greater efficiency, what would we get? We'd get a system in which the people in the healthcare sector would be literally employees and slaves of the government. How many of you think that's fair? I find all these people clamoring for health care and access to health care, and they want to do it through a government-dominated system. And I wonder whether at the work that they do, if they're not government employees, they would be content to have the terms on which they work dictated, to have the terms on which they work established in a way that had no regard for what ought to be their liberty. I don't think it's right that we should seek to achieve reform of our healthcare system by essentially curtailing the liberty of all the people in the healthcare sector. There is a better way. I've been on the citizens group that has been pushing and clamoring for just this sort of an approach to the national presidential debates. I've come under some heat from people in my party, but I don't care. Elections don't exist for parties, and they don't exist for candidates. They exist for the people, and the people ought to be presented with every choice that's on the ballot clearly. Get information, have debates in which everybody's on the ballot should be on the stage. And that way you can make a fair and informed choice. And I want to be clear on this, in case anybody doubts it. Throughout my political life, I have been one of those people who believes that we do, in fact, have to respect the trust that God has given us in this planet. If you have a serious understanding of what it means to care about your children and your grandchildren, then you must care that they have a place to live, a planet to inhabit, in which all the beautiful things and all the precious things have not been destroyed. And when we went through eras in human history where people just were rampantly disregarding that, it was wrong. But it is also wrong to use our concern about that trust as an excuse for expanding government control and government regulation and government bureaucracy without regard to whether it's needed to achieve the result. Well, I think one of the problems with looking at environment the way some people do is that it implies that we are alone in our responsibility for nature. And when you think that through, y'all, that means that you don't think God is there to take care of things.
That's exactly right.
It's different to regard something as a trust from God, because at the end of the day, your own sense of anxiety about it will be limited by your trust in God. And that's surely the approach we ought to be taking.
And God certainly still has power, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. I do believe that there's a place when you're dealing with challenges to security in the international community. There's a place for cooperation. We, after all, not only shouldn't we, from the point of view of our own interest, but it would be unfair to place the burden of policing the world on the United States. I oppose that idea. I think when problems arise in a given area or a given region, we ought to be working to mobilize effectively the countries in that region to meet their responsibilities. After all is said and done, we all recognize that in our own house and in our own neighborhood, we have a responsibility to try to keep the streets clean and the place safe, and we work to that end. And I think we ought to encourage people to think of the world that way and work with them. On the other hand, when you have been attacked, as we were on September 11th, you can't abdicate your responsibility for the defense of the people of this country to some deliberative body notorious for its inability to come to a conclusion. When you have been attacked, you must act without hesitation, with deep commitment, with a forthright dedication to the security of your people. Why on earth would you go to a blind body to ask them whether you need to do something about that which you clearly see? Terrorism cannot be defeated after the fact. It must be defeated before it strikes.